The neighbors warned her not to return, especially not in winter. But a 7-month pregnant woman named Sarah Miller drove all the way back to Duluth anyway with only her German Shepherd by her side. She thought she was just here to sign papers, sell her late aunt's cabin, and leave. But when her loyal dog began scratching beneath the floorboards, she uncovered a hidden room. Inside it, a secret her family kept alive through every blizzard for almost a century. What she found would change how this entire frozen town remembers its past and how she sees her own future. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's incredible how far these stories travel. Winter was a drowning whiteness swallowing Duluth, Minnesota in a silence that felt like a cathedral of ice. Sarah Miller kept both hands on the steering wheel, though her fingers were trembling. She was 32, tall but thin, in that exhausted way divorced women sometimes become, after months of sleeping badly and eating just enough to survive. Her skin was pale for an American woman who used to love the beach, her freckles dulled by lack of light, and her brown hair hung loose over her shoulders, heavy and slightly greasy, because she no longer cared to impress anyone. At 7 months pregnant, her belly pushed tight against the old beige wool coat she wore, and she constantly shifted to keep Ranger's leash from cutting into her wrist. Ranger, her 7-year-old German Shepherd, with a dense sable black and brown coat, sat in the passenger seat, ears constantly flicking, sensing the tension in his owner like a living antenna. He was large for his breed, broad in the shoulders, and his amber eyes were the only warm color inside that cold vehicle. Sarah kept glancing at him subconsciously whenever her heart rate began to rise, as if he were her anchor to sanity. The road into Duluth felt narrower than she remembered. Lined with pine trees stiff with frozen snow, their branches bending like the bones of ancient animals left out in the cold. She had not returned for 10 years. She had promised herself she would never return. That promise had been made long before this pregnancy, before the layoff, before the judge signed her divorce papers with one flick of his pen, as if ending a marriage was no heavier than declining a subscription email. That judge, a tall, bald man in his late 50s, with sharp cheekbones and a hollow stare, had barely looked at her while signing. She remembered thinking then that men like that became stone because every human heart they saw was a wound, and eventually even sympathy froze like lake water in January. Now she was back. Back because her Aunt Margaret died. Aunt Margaret, who had always worn old wool skirts, who had silver hair twisted into a neat bun, who had never remarried after her husband drowned during a storm on Lake Superior. Margaret had been reclusive, sharp-tongued, but surprisingly gentle when she let someone close. She had been a nurse in her youth, but then something happened. Sarah never learned the details, and Margaret left the hospital system forever and never spoke of it again. She lived alone near the lake, isolated. And now Sarah inherited that lonely cabin. The lawyer who called her a short Latina woman named attorney Rebecca Flores, maybe in her early 40s, had a precise voice like a metronome and a face that communicated efficiency more than warmth. That woman never smiled, never frowned, merely existed like a bureaucratic instrument. This property belonged to your aunt. It is yours now. The winter will make selling it difficult. If you intend to sell, it would be wise to get the papers signed soon. That was all. No condolences. No, how are you holding up? She could have been ordering office supplies. Sarah told no one she was coming back. Her ex-husband didn't need to know. He was already living with a girl named Courtney, who worked in digital marketing and did yoga twice a day. Sarah had once been a public school teacher, teaching third graders to read and write, convincing little minds that stories mattered. But the layoffs hit right after test scores dropped that one unlucky semester, and Sarah was let go. She had cried in the car that day, parked behind the school with her head on the steering wheel, Ranger in the back seat, whining because he could smell her grief. That was when something in her chest cracked open, and everything she was built in job, marriage, social circle fell apart. Now she was returning to a place she once swore she would never see again. Outside, the wind shook the car slightly, pushing snow in sideways ribbons across the windshield. Duluth in winter looked like both a graveyard and a sanctuary, depending on who you were. To Sarah, it felt like both at once. She tightened her hands on the wheel, feeling the ache in her knuckles. Something about this return felt like destiny, not coincidence. She whispered into the empty car, Ranger, I think I was supposed to come back. Ranger let out a low sound, almost a hum, as if in agreement. His ears perked forward. His whole posture was alert but calm, like a soldier who knew a battlefield was near but wasn't afraid of dying. As they crossed the city limits, the radio signal cut out completely, and she felt the world shift. Duluth was no longer a memory, it was a present Snow Lake wind ghost of her own childhood fears. She remembered her aunt's voice warning her when she was a child. In winter, the lake listens. The wind listens too. As a kid, Sarah thought that was just poetic adult nonsense. But at this moment alone, pregnant driving toward a cabin no one had lived in for decades, she wasn't so sure. She felt the baby shift inside her, pushing gently against her stomach wall. Sarah placed one hand over the belly unconsciously, a protective instinct older than human language. "I'm here because I have nowhere else," she whispered. But another part of her mind whispered something darker. "Or maybe because something needed you here." The snow thickened like falling ash. Duluth swallowed her car whole, and the road ahead disappeared into white. The cabin was smaller than Sarah remembered, almost swallowed by the winter piled around it, as if the snow itself wanted to bury the entire structure under a century of silence. When she pushed the front door open, the hinges screamed like a wounded animal, and Ranger immediately moved ahead of her with the confidence of a soldier clearing a dark hallway. The cabin smelled exactly like she imagined a forgotten life would smell: old pine smoke, long absorbed into wood, and something sweet but rotting gently somewhere deep inside the walls. Sarah was still in her beige wool coat, hugging her belly with both arms, the weight of her unborn daughter. Yes, she had already learned it was a girl, reminding her with every movement that she was no longer allowed to break the way she used to. "Easy, Ranger," she whispered, but her voice trembled. Ranger's ears were pointed toward the stone fireplace at the center of the living room. He let out that low growl he only did when something didn't make sense. His tail was not raised in aggression. It was stiff, as if his body was collecting information. He was bred to detect threats, and somewhere in the bones of this house, a ghost of a scent made him believe someone else had once stood there recently. Sarah walked across creaking floorboards toward a hallway near the kitchen, her boots leaving small, dark, wet prints on the dusty surface. She stopped at a built-in wall cabinet, carved oak, almost Victorian. She remembered it vaguely from childhood, though she had not been tall enough then to actually see inside. She brushed dust from the handle, tugged gently, and the door opened with a reluctant click. Inside were medical supplies in glass jars. Needles, old alcohol bottles half evaporated, gauze, cloth bandages, and dozens of small, hardbound notebooks stacked like bricks. Each cover labeled by year: 1958, 1959, 1960, 1961. Sarah reached for one, her skin prickling like static electricity was building in the room. The dates matched the time Margaret left the hospital system. When she opened it, the handwriting was delicate, careful, and oddly intimate. She remembered Margaret's hands, thin fingers, veins like blue rivers beneath the skin. But she had never imagined her aunt writing like this. The notes weren't medical procedures. They were lists of human beings. Henry L., frostbite fed 2 nights, left at dawn. Maria S., broken wrist, husband, violent, slept in attic, given bus fare. Elliot J., fell through ice near death, warm soup, left no name. There were dozens of names. Sarah's throat tightened. Aunt Margaret had been secretly helping people, people who were abandoned, voiceless, desperate, right in this cabin. Ranger let out a sharp bark, one bark almost like a warning shot. Sarah jerked her head up. She realized she wasn't alone. Not physically, there was no one here. But emotionally, she was not the only soul tethered to this place. The cabin was full of echoes. This place had been a sanctuary, and it terrified her that she had never known. She turned when she heard footsteps crunching, outside, slow and heavy. Ranger positioned himself in front of her, protective. The front door creaked again. Sarah's breath caught until she realized it was a man approaching the porch, brushing snow off his coat. He looked to be in his late 60s, broad shoulders, tall like an ex-factory worker who never softened even when retired. His face was weather-beaten, beard gray, and thick eyebrows, heavy and straight. When he knocked on the open door frame, he didn't look surprised to see her here. "You must be Margaret's niece," he said, voice deep, steady, as if he had been expecting her. "Name's Walter Jones." He introduced himself with a nod. His expression was not unkind, but it was guarded, like someone who learned to keep extra layers between himself and the world to survive disappointment after disappointment. His wife died 15 years ago of breast cancer. He mentioned it simply like stating the weather. It explained that loneliness in his eyes. Town said someone might be coming back, Walter said. And when I saw tracks on the road, figured I'd make sure you got in safe before dark. Ranger sniffed him, then stepped back respectful, indicating the man was not a threat. Sarah forced a polite smile, though her heart was pounding. She had to ask, did you know what Margaret was doing here? Walter didn't blink. We all knew, but no one talked about it. He looked toward the fireplace. In winters like these, some folks needed a place to not die. That line hit Sarah like a hammer to the chest. Walter tipped his hat slightly. Storm gets worse after sundown. I'll check back in morning. Then he left without another word. When he was gone, Sarah stood in the dim cabin, holding one of Margaret's notebooks against her chest, and she felt her daughter move inside her. Sarah whispered into the quiet air, almost afraid of the sound of her own voice, Aunt Margaret. What were you preparing me for? Ranger placed his head against her thigh, his warmth grounding her in this collapsing world. And Sarah realized the one question that terrified her the most was suddenly replacing every other question. Why did her dying aunt choose her to inherit this place? The storm swallowed the lake in darkness that felt endless. Sarah had not slept for more than a handful of minutes. She lay on an old couch in the living room, still in her beige wool coat, because the cabin was so cold that even breathing felt like inhaling knives of ice. The baby moved inside her occasionally in short rolling motions, as if the child could sense her mother's anxiety and was trying to remind her that she was not alone. Every time the baby kicked, Sarah placed a trembling hand over her belly, the shape of her palm visible through the coat, her thin fingers shaking with exhaustion. She had built this strange habit of whispering to her unborn daughter in moments of terror, as if she needed to prove she was still capable of protecting life. Ranger slept near the front door, his head resting on his paws like a sentry dog who never took off his uniform. His thick sable coat was puffed from the cold, but his breathing was slow and steady, nostrils occasionally flaring as he scanned the air for scents. He was trained to protect, and even in rest, he looked like a quiet soldier who had seen storms before and was never impressed by them. Outside, the wind slammed the windows with small fists of snow. Near 1 a.m., Sarah heard it 3 knocks, hard, measured, not the wind. Her heart instantly ricocheted against her ribs. Ranger snapped awake, ears stiff as stone body, rising in one smooth, controlled motion, as if springs were hidden inside his spine. He moved directly in front of the door. Sarah wanted to freeze, but some instinct stronger than fear rooted her to her feet. She moved slowly behind her dog, each step making the floor groan. She tried to swallow, but her mouth was too dry. The knocks came again, just 2 this time faster. She placed her hand over her belly again, and in her other hand she reached for the metal fire poker lying near the hearth. The closer she came to the door, the more her mind asked terrifying questions. What if someone dangerous found shelter here? What if Margaret had enemies? What if this person was not truly human? Her thoughts spiraled out of logic and into the old Minnesota childhood stories of winter spirits that took the shape of desperate travelers. Sarah forced herself to look through the frosty window. A figure stood on the porch, barely more than a blur of black coat snow plastered to his shoulders like armor. She opened the door only 3 inches enough and to reveal a man, maybe mid-30s. He had a rough, unshaven jaw, his dark brown beard patchy and uneven, as if he shaved with a dull blade days ago. His eyes were green but bloodshot wild from fear and cold. His lips were blue and his hands shook violently. He looked like the kind of man who had been confident once, maybe even arrogant in a younger life, but tonight all that was shattered. Please, he stuttered. My truck slid off just past the ridge, engine died. He was physically shaking so strongly that Sarah could not tell if it was from cold or terror, or both. He looked thin but wiry, like someone who lived mostly on gas station food and adrenaline. His face was pale beneath the frost, and there was a small scar near his right eyebrow that looked old and badly healed. The kind of scar you get when you grow up fighting boys bigger than you and never learn to stop. He introduced himself with a breath that broke in the middle of the sentence, I'm Michael. He didn't give a last name. His voice was deep but cracked with desperation. He had the air of someone who had been running away from something long before this storm ever began. Sarah hesitated, but Ranger did something unexpected. He stepped aside. Not fully, but enough to signal this man did not smell like danger. Just fear. Sarah opened the door wider. Michael stumbled inside, snow melting instantly onto the wooden floor. Sarah helped him take off his heavy coat. Beneath he wore layers of flannel and a thermal shirt, stretched over a thin chest that likely once had muscle. She fetched him a wool blanket, one that smelled faintly of cedar and old fireplace ash, maybe inherited from Margaret herself. She made tea. She found old tea bags in a tin in the kitchen and handed him the steaming cup. His hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. "Sit," she said, voice more commanding than she expected from herself. He looked at her with a kind of reverence, something wounded men often look at mothers with, even mothers still unborn. "If I didn't see your light," he whispered, voice cracking again, "I think I would have frozen out there." Sarah could not ignore the echo inside that sentence. She thought of Margaret's notebooks. All those strangers saved by warmth in the night. The baby kicked again. Sarah's breath caught. And for the first time since she arrived, she realized she might not be here to escape her life. She might be here to continue her aunt's. The morning after Michael arrived, the storm had calmed, but the lake still breathed fog, like something alive beneath the ice. Sarah moved slowly, her thin frame and pregnant belly, making every bend and twist heavier than it should be. But there was a new kind of vibration in her chest, an alertness that was not fear anymore, but something closer to purpose. Michael was still asleep in the armchair, one arm over his chest, the wool blanket pulled to his chin. He looked less like a desperate man now, and more like a boy who had once trusted the world before something broke that trust. Ranger slept near the door again, his ears flicking like antennae in dreams. Sarah could not yet explain it, but the cabin already felt different since Michael stepped inside. It felt inhabited, like a heart that suddenly remembered how to beat. She decided to fix the fireplace. Not just because it needed heat, but because the fire was now symbolic, like a lighthouse torch. The old bricks were cracked. She brought the tools she found in the shed, rusted pliers, a hammer that once belonged to her aunt, and a bucket of nails that looked older than her father's entire life. She knelt near the stone hearth, the rough wood floor hard beneath her knees, letting her palm press the warm belly of her child through the coat. That motion grounded her. She was not just one woman with a broken life. She was two lives in one body. And maybe this place had been waiting for exactly that. When she touched the underside of the hearth, the wood felt uneven, like something could be pried up. A piece of floorboard had a tiny metal ring embedded in it, flush with the wood, almost invisible if you weren't kneeling this close. Sarah froze. Her pulse climbed up her throat. Ranger suddenly stood up, staring directly at her tail, straight, body stiff. "You smell it too," she whispered. She hooked her fingers under the ring and lifted. The board rose so easily, like it had been opened 1,000 times. A rectangular hole stared back at her, a dark, narrow opening. She fetched a candle from the kitchen. She lit it with an old match, and fire sprang up with that sharp sulfur scent that stabbed her nose. She held the candle over the hole. Stone, bedsheet, a folded wool blanket, a small box of matches, 3 candles, a tin of ointment, a cloth bag, a place where a human could lie down and survive a night. The realization was not a metaphor. It was literal. Her aunt had a hidden shelter here, a sanctuary under the floor, a place someone could disappear into the cabin itself. Sarah did not cry. Instead, she felt her entire spine straighten. She wasn't merely part of this house by accident. This was a torch passed down in blood. She sat for a moment at the edge of the opening, breathing slowly so her heart would not explode. She imagined her Aunt Margaret, older, silver hair, pin-tight hands that once carried morphine, and sutures in war hands that later carried soup and blankets to nameless runaways. Margaret had not retired from medicine. She had simply changed battlegrounds. Sarah's eyes burned not from smoke, but from a sudden, overwhelming respect. She never got to speak to Margaret while she was alive. She closed the floorboard gently. When she turned, she found Michael standing at the doorway, blanket around his shoulders, hair messy, and eyes half awake. He had not shaved, and that uneven beard made him look like a man who was not accustomed to being taken care of. He stared at the closed floorboard. "What is that?" She weighed the risk of honesty. She saw fear, not malice, in his eyes. So she told him the truth. "My aunt used to help people here." Michael blinked once. His voice softened, breaking through whatever wall he usually held between himself and strangers. "People like me." Sarah nodded slowly. Ranger stepped forward and nudged Michael's hand with his nose. Michael hesitated, then placed his palm gently between Ranger's ears. There was no pretense in that touch. It was the touch of a man who had not been trusted by a living being in a very long time. And in that moment, Sarah realized the answer. Margaret did not only leave Sarah a house, she left her the mission. And Sarah, broken, abandoned, divorced, jobless, pregnant, was the next keeper of the flame. She stood up. She pressed her hand on the mantle. She spoke without thinking. I'm not here just to sell this place. It was not a statement. It was a vow. And in the quiet of the cabin, it felt like someone or something heard her. Sarah stayed. She could have packed Michael back into his truck once the storm cleared. She could have driven away herself. She could have gone south to some city where the winters didn't attempt to kill you. But she didn't. She woke up the next morning with her thin, pale arms wrapped around her belly, and she knew she was not going anywhere. Duluth in all its frozen severity was where she was meant to be now. She spent the afternoon shoveling the porch and cleaning the windows. She found an old red lantern in a drawer under the stairs, metal chipped glass still surprisingly intact. The lantern looked like something meant for railroad signals back in the 1940s. She cleaned it, replaced the wick, and lit it at dusk. She hung it above the porch so the flame glowed against the blue-black winter like a small ruby. The red lantern became the signal. If someone saw that light in the dark storm, they knew there was shelter here. It was a message she did not have to print in any newspaper. The light itself spoke the language of the stranded and the desperate. Michael watched her work, still in the borrowed coat and flannel shirt. He looked stronger now, not physically yet, but something in his face was rearranging itself like shame and fear were melting slowly and leaving behind a masculine steadiness he once had. He told Sarah he had not had anyone treat him with kindness in years. He used to work construction in Iowa, but a fight with his boss turned ugly. He broke the man's jaw in a moment of blind rage, and he ran before the police arrived. He never killed anyone, but he carried the guilt like a branding iron. His dark green eyes showed the self-hatred clearly when he spoke about it. Ranger had taken to him oddly quickly, and the dog now followed Michael outside when he chopped wood behind the cabin. Ranger was smart enough to read character. It meant something. In the next 2 days, the rumor quietly began to move through the town like an underground river. The rumor said Margaret's cabin had a keeper again. No one spoke Sarah's name in gossip. They simply said the Monroe place has light again. That was enough. People respected legacies here. Legacies took priority over laws, and especially over judgment. One morning, while Sarah and Michael were sorting old blankets and medicines, they found in the cabinets a quiet knock came. Not frantic like Michael's knock in the storm, soft, timid. When Sarah opened the door, she found a young woman in her mid-20s. She had short blonde hair cut unevenly, her cheeks bruised lightly beneath concealer, and she held a paper bag like a shield. She introduced herself with a quiet voice. "My name is Lily." She looked like the type who was constantly frightened of disappointing someone. Lily explained she worked part-time at the diner in town. She said she heard the place takes food. Sarah had no idea what that meant at first, until Lily held out the bag. Inside were 2 loaves of bread and a tin of soup. Lily explained that she and 3 other women who cleaned houses together had put in money to buy it as a sign of welcome. Sarah stared at her in disbelief, and Lily explained her own reason privately. She had fled an abusive fiancé a year ago and ran to Duluth to start over. Her voice broke when she said, "If your aunt saved people like me, thank you for keeping this alive." She left quickly after that, cheeks red from cold and embarrassment. She didn't stay. She didn't ask for help. She just wanted to give something back to the place that once gave her safety. It was that moment, watching Lily's small figure retreat down the snowy road, that finally made Sarah's throat tighten with emotion. People here didn't just remember the cabin. They owed it something. More food followed over the next days. Groceries left at the porch. Firewood stacked quietly near the back door. Someone left thick wool socks with a note for the baby when she comes. Someone else left a sealed box of prenatal vitamins. No signatures, no explanations. Silent gratitude and silent recognition. Michael offered to stay. He said he could fix the pipes, repair the shutters. Help Sarah prepare for the baby. Sarah didn't answer immediately. Trust had to be earned. But when Ranger casually leaned against Michael's leg one evening in the dim firelight, Sarah took that as the final sign. There were many kinds of guardians in this world, and maybe broken men who learned humility through nearly dying in snow deserve redemption too. Winter stretched on relentlessly. The sky never softened. But night after night, the red lantern remained lit at the porch, its flame glowing like a promise in blood-colored glass. Ranger sat near the door every evening, watching the horizon like a soldier on duty. Sarah would sit with one hand on her belly and the other hand on the armrest, feeling something steady awaken inside her. This cabin was not for profit, not for nostalgia, not for running away. It was a continuation. And she finally understood the cost a legacy like this demanded someone willing to remain. And Sarah was willing. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive as thunder. Sometimes, they come as strangers at midnight. Sometimes they come as a red lantern in a sea of snow. Sometimes they come as a pregnant woman with nothing left except the courage to keep one small fire burning. And maybe that's one of God's quiet lessons, that heaven isn't only far above the clouds. Sometimes it lives inside people who choose to love anyway. In your life, too, there are storms. There are days that feel endless, white cold, and hopeless. But keep your small fire burning, because God still sends his angels, and sometimes those angels look ordinary. Sometimes they look like you, choosing kindness when the world gives you nothing back. Before you go, share the story. Write a comment where you're watching from, and if this touched your heart even a little, subscribe to this channel because this world still needs stories of compassion. May God bless you. May he send warmth into your home. May he guard your steps in every storm ahead, and may he place his hand over you tonight the same way he protected them in that little cabin in the snow.